Well, can I welcome people back to the second half of this morning's Public Audit Committee. Agenda item 3 is our first consideration of the new vessels for the Clyde and Hebrides Audit Scotland report into arrangements for the delivery of vessels 801 and 802. Can I welcome witnesses to the meeting this morning? The Auditor General, Stephen Boyle, who's joined with a team of 3 people this morning. Anthony Clark, who's the Interim Director of Performance, Audit and Best Value. Angela Canning, who's an Audit Director at Audit Scotland. And Jill Miller, who's an Audit Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value at Audit Scotland. We're also joined virtually this morning by a guest MSP who's taking part in the evidence session this morning, and that's the Highlands and Islands MSP, Rhoda Grant, who is joining us remotely. So, Rhoda, you are very welcome. And can I remind you that if you want to come in at any point in particular, if you indicate by putting an R in the chat room, and we'll do our best to bring you in. What I'd like to do to begin with is to invite the Auditor General to give us an opening statement. Then we've got a series of questions, and I have to say that we may not cover all of the ground that we need to cover this morning, in which case we might be looking to have a part 2 of this session with you, Auditor General. But I'm going to begin by inviting you to make an opening statement.
Convener, many thanks. Good morning, committee. Under Section 23 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000, I am bringing to the committee my performance audit report on the project to deliver 2 new ferries for the Clyde and Hebrides. The main headlines surrounding these 2 vessels are well known. They are significantly late and considerably over budget. My report sets out the reasons for the delays and cost overruns and the remaining challenges in completing the vessels. It highlights a multitude of failings over the last 6 years. In particular, my report highlights that Scottish Ministers approved the contract award to Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited in October 2015 without the standard financial guarantees being in place, and contrary to the advice of Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, CMAL, the public body which owns most of the vessels on the network. There is insufficient documentary evidence to explain why these risks were accepted, and I consider that there should have been a proper record of this important decision. Only 2 months after the contract was awarded, CMAL identified concerns with the project, and over time, problems, delays and costs escalated. Scottish Ministers approved several financial and non-financial interventions to try and get the project back on track, but these had little impact. FMAIL entered administration in August 2019, following unresolved financial disputes with CMAL. By this point, the Scottish Government and CMAL had paid FMAIL over £128 million, but the vessels remained far from complete. In December 2019, the Scottish Government nationalised the shipyard with the stated intention of helping to get the vessels completed as quickly as possible, protect jobs and sustain shipbuilding on the Clyde. Now operated by a public body, Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow, there are still major operational issues at the yard that remain unresolved, and remedial work on the vessels, which should have been completed within 7 months, continue to be uncovered. Since my report was published, the new accountable officer of Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow has updated Parliament to report that vessel 801 is now expected to be delivered between March and May 2023, 5 years later than promised, and vessel 802 between October and December 2023. These new vessels were intended to create more capacity and improve reliability across the Clyde and Hebrides network. They were also meant to bring social, economic and environmental benefits. That these have not yet been achieved over 6 years on is of course a source of frustration for island communities which rely upon lifeline ferries. It is imperative, therefore, that Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow delivers these vessels within the new timescales. Closer collaboration with CMAL is a positive step. But as I set out in my report, there are several operational and workforce challenges remaining that need to be addressed if these vessels are to be delivered. I make recommendations, Convener, to help support this. After the vessels are completed, all public sector bodies involved must turn their attention to fully considering what went wrong with this project, learning lessons, and crucially preventing a repeat of such problems in the future. Convener, as ever, myself and my colleagues will do our utmost to answer the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Auditor General, for that concise and very clear opening statement. I'm going to turn first of all to the Deputy Convener, Sharon Dowie, who's got a number of questions to put. Sharon.
Good morning, Mr Boyle. Good morning, everybody. So again, your team have provided a report which, in your words, of showing a multitude of failings. A comprehensive report, even with the lack of documentary evidence that was available, and it's obviously raised an awful lot of concerns and a lot more questions. Once again, the issue of transparency within the Scottish Government has been raised. The report makes it clear that the project's been riddled with problems and delays over 6 years. The vessel's now 4 years late, now looks like 5 years late. The cost 2.5 times the original budget at the moment. Worryingly, paragraph 105 states that the Scottish Government is committed to paying the additional vessel costs regardless of the final price. And all of this at the expense of the taxpayers and seemingly with no accountability from ministers. When we read paragraph 141, it states, because engines and equipment were purchased several years in advance, warranties have expired and any repairs required before vessel 801 enters service could be expensive and time-consuming. We now know that there will be delays due to cabling being too short for the vessels, and to add another layer to the saga, once the vessels eventually do come into service, there's now talk that the vessels are 40 metres too long for the harbour it serves, and that the masters of the boat who've been practising using simulators have been unable to dock them safely. So it seems the story will continue, the costs will continue to rise, and there may well be further delays. And that's before we start talking of flawed decision-making processes, lack of documentary evidence, and the Scottish Government ignoring alarm bells that have gone off repeatedly. So it's understandable why there's a lot of interest in the report. So going back to 2015, and moving on to my first question, looking at Exhibit 1. In August 2015, ministers announced Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited, or FMEL, as the preferred bidder. Could you tell me more about the decision-making in that? And I believe there was 7 bids from 6 companies. So who would have taken the decision to award the contract to FMEL, taking into account that it does say that FMEL was the most expensive bidder?
Good morning, Deputy Convener. In respect of Exhibit 1, what we look to do is to set out the very significant chain of events up to current day. Right at the start of that exhibit, we note the identification of FMEL as the preferred bidder. I'm going to bring colleague Jill Miller in a moment just to kind of talk the committee through the process around the procurement. But before doing so, I think it may be helpful just for the purposes of our report to sit with the scope of our work that we set out. We didn't review the detail of the procurement, the design arrangements of the ferry contract. In doing so, we took a judgment based on the evidence considered by the Rural Economy Committee in the previous session of the Parliament, having their investigation taking considerable evidence on the design arrangements and the procurement circumstances, that our work would be best served by picking up from the point of the identification of FMEL as the preferred bidder through to the current day and some of the circumstances and challenges that have unfolded therein. Nonetheless, in the report, we do give some of the history of the procurement circumstances, and I'll maybe invite Jill just to update the committee on some of the decisions arrived by the various parties, the use of cost quality indicators and so forth, if that would be helpful. Jill.
Hi there. Yes, as you said, in March 2015, CMAL received 7 bids from 6 shipbuilders. Just want to emphasise that those bids were all anonymised when the evaluation panel over the period March to August were looking at those bids. The bids were evaluated on a 50-50 price quality score, and overall the panel assessed FML's anonymised bid as achieving the top score overall. So in terms of when the decision was made, like I said, that was over the period March to August. We understand that then the CMAL board had to review the evaluation panel's assessment. FML had been identified as its leading bidder at that point. However, we're aware that on the 20th of August 2015, Transport Scotland submitted a paper to ministers to say that FML was the preferred bidder, and said that the First Minister would be announcing this at a visit to the yard on the 31st of August 2015. We understand at that stage that CMAL and FML still had not negotiated the point over the builder's refund guarantee, and it wasn't indeed until after the announcement on the 31st of August that FML stated that it was unable to provide the 100% refund guarantee, and the best offer was a 25% refund guarantee.
Do you know who was on the evaluation panel?
I don't know the exact members, but I do know that CMAL and CalMac were involved.
CMAL and CalMac. Thanks. And so in September, FML confirms it is unable to provide a builder's refund guarantee, which was a mandatory requirement. Did FML give a reason why they could not give the builder's refund guarantee, and why it had not been mentioned in their bid?
The actual procurement process was out with the scope of this audit, so we don't have the details of FML's bid. But we do know that the pre-qualification exercise, it was made clear that the provision of a 100% refund guarantee was mandatory, and we know that FML passed that qualification stage because it was given the invitation to tender. The contract, the draft contract, which was part of the invitation to tender, made it clear that the the builder's refund guarantee was mandatory. All bidders had the opportunity to provide comments on that draft contract, and FML did not, thus implying it was willing to offer the builder's refund guarantee.
Okay. So in September, CMAL advises Transport Scotland of the risks and states its preference to start the procurement process again. And it says later that Transport Scotland fully appraised Scottish ministers of the significant financial and procurement risks. In October, Transport Scotland advises CMAL that Scottish ministers are aware of the risk and are content for CMAL to award the contract to FML. So is there any documentation to show this and to explain the reasons why the contract still went ahead?
This is undoubtedly one of the key findings from our report, Deputy Convener, that with CMAL highlighting the extent of the risks, and as Jill rightly points out, that the importance of the provision of the guarantee, the 100% guarantee, is particularly significant in the context of a shipbuilding contract, because of the nature of the contract really allows for the builder to progress, and the transfer of risk rests with the shipbuilder. The buyer is insulated by the 100% guarantee, but in the circumstances where that didn't occur, as we have here, risk flows back to the buyer, albeit with a 25% offsetting, and then an additional provision about final payment that offsets some of the risk. Anthony might want to comment a bit about the transparency point in a minute. What we're effectively seeing is that Transport Scotland advised ministers of the nature of the risks, allowing for CMAL's significant concerns and indeed position that the contract should be re-tendered. But the ministers took a view that they wished to proceed with the contract, cognisant of those risks. As we set out in the report, there is no documentary evidence of how those risks were considered or how intended they would be managed during the running of the contract. Transparency is hugely important. It matters that important decisions of this nature are set out and recorded. But through our audit work, we haven't been able to be provided with any evidence to set out how those risks would be managed. If I may, Deputy Convener, I may bring in Anthony, who want to say a bit more about how these circumstances work normally.
In these circumstances, one would expect the accountable officer in Transport Scotland to share their thoughts, their ideas, their risks, their concerns, and make proposals to Scottish ministers, upon which ministers can then reflect and make a formal decision. As the Auditor General has already indicated, one would expect that to be recorded and documented. In the circumstances of this audit, we requested the documentary evidence, but as the Auditor General has already said, none was forthcoming to us. So therefore, we're not in a position to offer advice to the committee on what thought processes took place and what advice Transport Scotland gave to ministers, or on what basis the Transport Minister, I think on this occasion, determined that they should recommend that the contract should proceed. As the Auditor General has already said, this is quite a significant finding, and I suspect it's something that the committee may wish to take evidence on in due course.
So there was no documentation at all to show the communication between CMAL, Transport Scotland, the ministers, or who had actually been spoken to? There was nothing at all that came out when we were doing the audit?
We made several requests to the Scottish Government and to Transport Scotland to receive information on this matter. None was forthcoming. I don't know if Jill has anything she wants to add to this.
Right, so what we did have was the submission that went to ministers around the risks, which set out CMAL's concerns, the clear risks. It also set out some of the amendments that CMAL had agreed with FML to try and mitigate some of those risks. And it also had set out some of the assurances that Transport Scotland were putting in place to kind of mitigate CMAL's concerns. And that was around the lines of CMAL not having to pay back the loan, the vessel loan, until the vessels were completed, and Scottish ministers looking favourably to CMAL's requests for additional funds if any of these risks came to pass. So we saw that documentation. But that part of that documentation, Transport Scotland had offered minister to have a discussion with the CMAL board to discuss its concerns. We don't know if that went ahead. We asked for all documentation related to the minister's decision. We asked that of Transport Scotland and Scottish Government, and we didn't receive any. So we are not clear if there was any discussions. We're not sure what discussions took place up to decide what the assurances that Transport Scotland would give CMAL. So we don't know on what basis ministers decided to accept the risks and to proceed with the contract award.
Okay.
I think there are other members of the committee who want to come in on this point. So I'm going to bring them in. But just on this point, Jill Miller, that you made, and I direct this first of all to the Auditor General. If there is no documentary evidence, why not? Is it hidden? Is it missing? Or does it simply not exist?
We can only speculate on that point, Convener. I think, as Jill and Anthony have set out through our audit work, we request all relevant documentary evidence from public bodies in respect of our audit work. The Public Finance and Accountability Act 2000, Section 24, gives us rights of access and provision where there are circumstances that we know of the existence of a document but that it's not being provided. We can and have on occasion cited such provision to secure access. But where there are no relevant documentation to support a decision, that becomes harder. So we don't entirely know whether it's a case of there isn't a document that supports this important decision or that we've asked for it and we weren't provided it. I suspect it's the former rather than the latter. But we can only speculate, Convener, and probably that would be unhelpful to do so. Okay, but potentially there could be a breach of the Act. As I say, through our audit work, we ask for all relevant documentation. And I think, and especially given the significance of this that we've highlighted in the report, it's our understanding and the position that we've reached that there is no documentary evidence that supports the decision of such significance. And that led us quite clearly to the conclusion that we consider that there really ought to have been a level of documentation to understand why the scale of the risks, so unusual in the extent of this contract, were acceptable. Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey at this point. Willie.
Thanks, Convener. It's on the point about the builder's refund guarantee at the very beginning of the process. My understanding, having read the papers, Auditor General, is that within a standard sort of shipping model contract, that's assumed, that's embedded as part of the contract agreement. So it was assumed by default that FML had consented to provide that guarantee 100%, but only a month later, they said they couldn't. Is that potentially a clear case of FML misleading the client at the outset of the contract?
I think, Mr Coffey, as we've touched on, our report picks up at a certain point in terms of, we haven't reviewed the detail of the tender evaluation and procurement exercise, but we do note the significance of the builder's refund guarantee in a shipbuilding contract, and the extent to which that insulates the buyer from risk and so forth. CMAL's position, and they'll of course have the opportunity, I'm sure, to restate this for themselves, that if a buyer doesn't raise an objection, whether it's about builder's guarantee or any other aspects of the contract, there is a tacit acceptance of the terms and conditions of the contract. That it became known at a later stage, shortly after the identification of the preferred bidder, that FML weren't in a position to offer the full 100% builder's refund guarantee. That presented the buyer and Scottish Government Transport Scotland ministers with an option to whether they wish to proceed or otherwise. But I think the position would be, as I suggest, a tacit acceptance of the terms and conditions unless otherwise stated.
Investigate why that guarantee was withdrawn within a month, or did they just proceed to make the best of the circumstances that they then found themselves in?
So Jill will want to say a wee bit more in a minute, but there were undoubtedly discussions between FML, CMAL in respect of the builder's guarantee and the position that was ultimately reached. And we set out some of this detail in the report, that instead of the full 100% being offered, 25% builder's refund guarantee was eventually the position that was offered, along with some of the other mitigations that Transport Scotland were able to arrive at. But these don't equate to 100% builder's refund guarantee, and most importantly, the overall substance of it, about the scale of the transfer of risk back into the buyer, as opposed to how you would expect to operate with a standard shipping contract, that the 100% guarantee provides the buyer with the surety in the event of circumstances going awry. Jill might want to say a bit more about how those events unfolded.
Yeah, so, as we all know, FML was a relatively new company. It was formed in October 2014. And CMAL was aware that as a new company with very little financial history, it might struggle to get a bank to provide it with a 100% guarantee. But CMAL had assumed that CBC, as FML's parent entity, would provide a parent guarantee for FML. We've obviously had discussions with CBC as well, and they said that that was never the case. But as the Auditor General has already said, the requirement for the full BRG was stated in the contract very clearly, and FML did not make any comments on that contract, and therefore when CMAL was evaluating its bid, there was no indication that it was not going to provide the 100% refund guarantee at that stage.
I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thanks. I think Craig Hoy has got some questions again in this area, so I'm going to turn to Craig to put some questions.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Bond. Normally when you come before us, you bring reports that give us the complete picture. You put the pieces of the jigsaw together on how much money has been spent and the best value that's been achieved through that. And generally also there's an audit trail that underpins that. But today on 2 lifeline ferries for our island communities, we don't have that. Your report clearly identifies multiple failings, but there are key pieces of the jigsaw that are missing. And I think, as the convener said, either these have gone missing, they weren't produced, or they've been withheld from you. So my first question is perhaps just a bit wider than those that I'll turn to. But when all is told, over or close to £500 million could end up having been spent, first with a company owned by someone with close links to the party of government, the SNP, and latterly by a company owned by the government itself. How concerned should Parliament be and the public be that you have been unable to publish a report that tells the full story of how this money has been spent and why?
There's clearly a frustration, Mr Hoy, from us that we weren't able to review all what we would consider to be the relevant evidence. I think, as I mentioned to the convener, I think our judgment is not that evidence has been withheld from us during the course of our audit work, but rather that an important piece of documentary evidence wasn't prepared to arrive at the judgment that ministers arrived at to accept the scale of risk so unusual in the scale of this contract and contrary to the advice of the public body CMAL that oversees the contract. So frustration, I'm sure it's a matter that civil service will want to reflect on about how they best document important decisions that significantly influence not just the use of public money but the provision of extremely important aspects of public services.
Looking at paragraph 27 of your report, it says that on the 8th of October 2015, Transport Scotland advised Scottish ministers about CMAL's considerable concerns about awarding the contract to FML. We would have expected, obviously, any discussions to have been minuted in the company of civil servants and perhaps Transport Scotland, and no doubt there should have been note takers, but you say you have no insight into those discussions on the 8th of October. But what we do find out from the report is the very next day, Transport Scotland, or the day after Transport Scotland advised ministers of CMAL's concerns, ministers said that they were content to proceed. So there must have been some discussion during that day. That therefore does imply, however, that ministers were aware of the risks and that they therefore chose to ignore them in awarding that contract. Is that correct?
So that's our understanding, not that there weren't any communications, but they haven't been documented, and that CMAL's position, the extent of the risks, variation from the standard builder's guarantee in the contract, and that the risk flowing back to the buyers, public bodies, were part of those discussions. But as we've touched on, that those weren't adequately documented.
You would normally expect where there is a division between the civil service and ministers for there to be a ministerial direction issued. To your knowledge, was there no ministerial direction issued, and wouldn't it have been far better had there been such a document produced?
The Scottish Public Finance Manual sets out the provisions for such circumstances in Scotland. It refers to the term written authority as opposed to ministerial direction, which set out the circumstances where an accountable officer considers that they would be unable to achieve value for monies in respect of implementation of a policy request from ministers. We don't believe that there was a written authority or ministerial direction requested from civil servants in these circumstances. And therefore, again, I'd be entering into the territory of speculation as to why one wasn't requested or otherwise. It is clear that it would have been an option had a civil servant considered that they wouldn't be achieving value for money, that they could have asked for such written authority. But it remains our understanding, Mr Hoy, that no such request was asked.
Just rewinding a little bit, something that Jill said in relation to the awarding of the contract and the tender process, which I think is another key, perhaps missing piece of the jigsaw. And I know that you, at the outset, talked about the scope of your report. But it has been suggested that obviously FML was the most expensive and potentially the highest quality, but yet not being able to give a refund guarantee. It is still been suggested that significant additional appointments were awarded for quality at some stage in that process. Have you had any sight of the actual tender scoring, and should it not now be published if it has not already been so?
I'll ask Jill to pick this one up.
Hi, so we did not look at that. However, we obviously reviewed the information that was given to the former REC committee's inquiry onto the procurement of these two vessels, and I understand that CMAL has provided the scores for each of the bids.
And just looking in relation to payments and milestones, just to move this on a little bit, again, there are potentially some missing pieces of the jigsaw here. Speaking to those in the industry, it appears that it's quite common for contracts for ships to have a payment schedule for 5 payments, but each of the contracts for 801 and 802 had 15 scheduled payments. Did you explore why this happened and who agreed to it? And isn't this, alongside perhaps the failure to provide a refund guarantee and the plea for accelerated payments, further evidence of the financial fragility of FML?
Jill can come in again in a minute. I'm sure I want to say a bit more about the variation in the use of milestone payments in this contract relative to the industry norm. But just before doing so, I think you mentioned, Mr Hoy, about some of the financial circumstances of FML, and those are noted at various points in our report and indeed our public record before our audit work began, about the additional financial support that was provided to the yard and alongside the variation of the use of milestone payments. So we do note that the use of, we set out Exhibit 3 in the report, the extent of milestone events and payments. But before handing to Jill, maybe just make the point, one of the points that became clear during our audit work, and perhaps at odds with other large public sector infrastructure contracts, is that the use of milestone payments in a contract didn't bear a direct relation to necessarily to quality or indeed progress, but that this is also the industry norm in shipbuilding for contracts. Jill, I'm sure, will want to say a bit more to support the committee's understanding.
Yes, Mr Hoy, you're correct that typically the payment schedule is 5 equal payments of 20%. However, it's not unusual for the buyer and the shipbuilder to agree a payment schedule that best suits the project. It's our understanding that during the period of discussions after FML was awarded, it was announced as preferred bidder and the contract being awarded in October, that there were 7 iterations of that milestone schedule suggested by FML to help ease its cash flow over the duration of the project. We discussed this with CMAL and they said that was not a concern to them, how they distributed the funding and when, because ultimately they were not paying more than the £97 million.
And just finally, if I can just close by just a question about the loan payments that the Scottish Government was making. It appears that the accelerated payments and the loans did point to a significant cause for concern in terms of cash flow at FML. The Scottish Government, certainly in relation to the first loan, was effectively secretly loaning the company up to £15 million and then latterly a further £30 million to keep a company afloat and certainly in positive cash flow terms so that it could continue to service another part of the government. And to a certain extent, there's almost a sort of Ponzi scheme at the heart of this. The government claimed that the original £15 million was commercially confidential, but that reasoning was dropped when the further £30 million loan was made available. Do you have any understanding why the government changed its tune in relation to the commercial confidentiality of those loans?
This was subject to consideration by the predecessor committee following receipt of again, my predecessor's Section 22 reports on the Scottish Government. And if memory serves me correct, Mr Hoy, where a loan is made on a commercial basis, as there were in these circumstances, that there wasn't an immediate obligation upon the Government to inform the Scottish Parliament. That the £30 million loan was brought to Parliament's attention alongside the details of the £15 million loan that had been made earlier was a matter for the Government, and I think we've set out our views on that, the need for transparency in such circumstances. But also linked to, again, a theme I know the committee is interested in, about, in more general terms, how financial interventions are made in private companies, the framework that supports that, the exit strategy, the financial terms and so forth. But none of that detracts from the fact that where there are interventions of such scale, and particularly in these circumstances, that ought to be done as transparently as possible.
Thanks. Just one final quick question, if I may, convener. It appears that a significant number of senior management from FML, when they left, were then covered by non-disclosure agreements. where significant sums of public money are involved, is it acceptable in your view that such agreements are put in place? And has this hampered your audit work in any respects?
So we, in gathering evidence to support our report, we spoke to a wide range of people who were involved in the project, current and former officials. Jill can say a bit more, I'm sure, about some of the detail of that. But we weren't able to speak to all of the former directors of FMIL that we were able to, because of the presence of the Non-Disclosure Act and the willingness of both not on the part of the individual, but the circumstances of the contract, which then fell to the administrators of FMIL and their willingness to give assurance that there would be no follow-through should somebody be seen to breach the terms of that. In overall terms, I don't think it has hampered our evidence gathering or the conclusions that we have reached. I think we set out in very clear terms the events that followed. But I should say, Mr Hoy, is that there are many differing views about the events that took place at the Ferguson Marine and the progress of these vessels. And we note that a number of times in the report that the former owners of FML, CMAL, Transport Scotland, there is no consensus shared about why the events unfolded. Nonetheless, we look to, when we're undertaking audit work, speak to as many people as possible. But it is fair to say that we weren't able to speak to one of the individuals who wished to participate in the audit work. If I may very briefly bring Jill in, I'm sure she wants to say a bit more about that.
I'd just like to say that we reviewed an extensive amount of evidence for this audit, covering a number of events over a 6-year period. There's substantial evidence that we went through, a lot of documentation, we spoke to a lot of people. As public sector auditors, we were focused on the roles of the public sector organisations involved and their arrangements, setting up the contract, managing the contract, how it responded when it went wrong. So it was right that we focused our evidence on those. However, as the Auditor General has said, there were very conflicting views on what had gone wrong. It was very important for us to understand FML's view of events. FML former management submitted a lot of information to the former REC inquiry into the project, so we reviewed all of that. We also spoke to one of FML's former chief executives and one of its former directors. There's also 2 directors currently at FMPG who formerly worked at FML, and we spoke to them about their experiences pre and post nationalisation. And we also spoke to the workforce representatives at FMPG who formerly worked for FML as well. So I feel that in the round we were able to get a good understanding of FML's point of view.
Thank you. Auditor General, can I just take you back to one of the questions which Craig Hoy put to you, and that was around written authority or ministerial direction, because I think this is quite central to the debate about transparency, accountability and where decisions were made. Because so when I review the correspondence that took place on the 8th of October and then the 9th of October, I do discern that there may have been written authority at work. So the email from Transport Scotland, which reflects CMAL's concerns about the risks associated with the contract, says, the board would wish the Minister to be appraised of these risks and to acknowledge to the board that he fully understood the potential risk of assigning a contract to FML under these circumstances. The board feel it is their absolute duty to point out the risks to their shareholder, and in that respect would expect approval should Scottish Government, with this project to proceed, would expect to receive direction to that effect. So they actually use the expression direction quite explicitly in that correspondence. We then see within the space of 24 hours, the very next day, the reply is submitted, in which, in a letter to Eric Ostergrad from the Director of Aviation, Maritime Freight and Canals Transport Scotland, dated the 9th of October, they say in paragraph 6, the Scottish Ministers both in their capacity as CMAL's sole shareholder and more generally, also confirm that CMAL is authorised, so they use that word, is authorised to enter into the contracts and any associated documentation. And paragraph 10 of that letter says, I can confirm that the Scottish ministers, plural, have considered and approved the contents of this letter. So it does look very much as though there was written authorisation, that there was ministerial direction, but it doesn't appear to have been recorded as required under the Act. Do you have any comments on that?
It's a fair assessment, Convener, that the substance of the discussions were consistent with what I would understand to be ministerial direction or written authority, but the application of it were inconsistent with the requirements of the Scottish Public Finance Manual. One of which I should say is that the Auditor General for Scotland is informed in writing if there is an event that is identified as a request for written authority. No such information came to the Office of the Auditor General for Scotland during those discussions. So whilst there is an exchange of correspondence and clear setting out of the views, we didn't then see that translate into, I suppose, the formality, the record keeping that we would say is clearly consistent with the request for written authority.
But again, it could also represent a breach of the Public Finance and Accountability Act. If there was written authorisation, if there was ministerial direction and it was not recorded either with you or with the clerk of this committee, which is also one of the requirements of the Act.
So, Convener, I think we probably pushing up against some of the boundaries of our analysis of it and perhaps into the realms of legal judgment as to whether the events that took place are consistent with the Act or otherwise. What I'm clear on is that none of the government officials have identified that there was written authority requested from ministers and approved as such. And on that basis, we've not been able to say so and are clear in our judgment that there was no formal written authority.
Thank you. And obviously we will have to consider as a committee how we can best seek to get to the bottom of that. We are limited for time, and I'm conscious that Colin Beattie has a series of questions which he wants to put, so I'm going to invite Colin to put those questions to you now, Auditor General. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, obviously this issue about the ferries first came about as a result of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee's report of 9th December 2020, in which they asked you to carry out your investigation. And I presume that was what triggered your investigation at that time. Is that correct?
I should say, Mr Beattie, yes, of course, the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee's review references their request for Audit Scotland to undertake further work. As the committee will be aware, is that I'm independent. I'm not directed by any particular committee of the Scottish Parliament in forming our work programme. So whilst we absolutely cognisant of the work of the committee, I think, as I mentioned to Mr Coffey a few minutes ago, is that our interest in ferries, the use of public finance and loans had been consistent for a number of years, which is fundamentally an issue of real public interest and public expenditure. So in drawing together all of those sources, we felt it was appropriate for us to undertake further work, and hence today's report.
Which is in line with your letter to the committee. The report itself obviously would have been something that you would have reviewed as part of your audit process in this. I assume that's correct?
Yeah, yes, of course.
Now, looking at the report, there are some very strong statements made in this report. Most particularly paragraph 160, which says there is strong evidence that the contractor deliberately proceeds to construct specific section of the vessel, either out of sequence or not according to the proper specifications, purely as a means of triggering milestone payments on the contract. And again, paragraph 157, where evidence is given that work was carried out either incorrectly or out of sequence in order that bigger payments could be made against the contract. And interestingly, paragraph 158, where it says that invoices presented were rejected on the basis that related to other projects. Now, it seems clear that on the evidence taken by the committee, they had great concerns about the contractor. They also say in paragraph 153 that the lawyers to CMAL had advised that they had to make the payments that were called for because that was in the contract. And of course, they didn't want to be in a position where they broke the contract. Again, in paragraph 154, there's a statement here in the evidence that Ferguson's deliberately slowed down some of the subcontracting. Now, in your report, maybe I missed something, but I don't see directly where you have addressed that, because this is very serious. It's very serious indeed. And if what the Rural and Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee concluded is correct, then what action needs to be taken is the question.
So there's some very significant sections of the Rural Economy Committee's report that you reference, Mr Beattie, in terms of work being undertaken out of sequence, allegations to trigger payments not done correctly, invoices relating to other projects and so forth. As I mentioned at the start of evidence this morning, we took a view about the scope of our work, as we always do with any audit, that our work would be best served by picking up this matter following the Rural Economy Committee's report and looking at the circumstances after the identification of FML as the preferred bidder, rather than repeating much of the extensive evidence that the Rural Economy Committee took about the nature of the procurement, the design, the contract. Clearly, we are not shipbuilding experts. And we also know, in particular, in arriving at the judgment about the scope of our work, that there were conflicting expert views about the nature of how this contract ought best to be operated. Independent experts who disagreed. And therefore, our judgment that we arrived at, that we'd be better looking at the use of public money after the identification of the preferred bidder. None of that detracts from the examples that you provide. I should say that there were clearly very significant events during the course of the running of the contract. But I think as we reasonably, and consistent with the Rural Economy Committee position, is that there is a significant disagreement between FML and CMAL over how the contract was running. Mediation and arbitration was explored between the parties, and eventually the position, as we set out in our report, was that the course of action that CMAL and the government recommended to FML was that they pursue this through the court session. Clearly, FML took a view that that wasn't possible for them, and, as we know, subsequently entered into administration.
But, I mean, the conclusions reached by the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee have serious implications, and they do need to be addressed, surely. Because if there is this level of contractor failure, that has contributed massively to the costs and the delays in this project.
Yeah, so we would, I think as we finalise the report, we recommend that there needs to be a fuller review. Lessons learned feels too glib to describe the circumstances before us, Mr Beattie, of the circumstances that took place in arriving at a contract that is many years late, 2.5 times the original budget to establish how these ought to be delivered in the future. We haven't done that in its entirety given the fact that, as I mentioned about the work of the Rural Economy Committee, that the project is still being undertaken. But we share the substance of your concern that there needs to be a fuller review. And we're pleased that some of our recommendations have already been acknowledged by CMAL about the adequacy of the contract, the need for the review of milestone payments to be more closely aligned to quality and progress. But I'm quite sure that there will be more reviews that will follow the consideration of our report.
In effect, your report has not addressed the issue of contractor failure and the impact of that, because I don't see it in your report. The Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee has certainly raised the flag on that. I would have thought it would be a priority to look at. I mean, that's our public money that has been paid out to this company that has not, according to the evidence of this committee, it's not been paid out in the manner in which it should have been. And yet it's been paid out according to contract by CMAL on the advice of their lawyers.
I'll maybe bring Anthony in. He wants to come in a moment. I'm not sure I would agree entirely with your assessment that the report doesn't identify concerns or problems in terms of the running of the contract or the work of the contractor. I think I would point to the report that we reference of the turnaround director upon entering their role, about the scale of operational failures in the yard, the extent of issues, as the Deputy Convener mentioned in her question, the extent to which the management of assets, warranties and so forth, the very recent further information about the quality of cabling and so forth that's been uncovered. So very significant, to again refer to the words of the former turnaround director, operational failures in the yard, and that will no doubt have contributed to the late running of the contract. What we also say in today's report, though, is that there are many accountabilities and reasons why we are in the circumstances that we are today, the performance of the contractor being one of those. But if I may, I'll bring Anthony. I think he's more to comment on this point.
I was going to highlight the points that the Audit Team has already made in terms of reference to the Turnaround Director's report and the deficiencies it highlighted in the management of the shipyard pre and to an extent post-nationalisation. The other point I wanted just to draw out, if I may, is the very clear reference in the report to the weaknesses in the contracting arrangements, which in the absence of a builder's refund guarantee placed real risk, I think, to the Scottish Government and others in the use of public money. If you look at paragraphs 33 of the report onwards, Mr Beattie, we highlight the deficiencies in terms of the contract, setting out CMAL's and FMAL's responsibilities for managing the project, but it's very clear that the milestones weren't clearly defined and weren't linked to quality standards. And you yourself, Mr Beattie, have acknowledged the fact that CMAL took legal advice on this and found themselves obliged to make the payments, even if there were perhaps concerns about aspects of the quality and delivery of the ship.
It just seems such a big and fundamental gap in the overall picture here. And again, I'm coming back. I mean, I'm relying here on the good work of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. I don't see where that's been built on in the Audit Scotland report in order to bring out that part of it, which is so critical. And yes, we can all argue about the contract and so forth, and there's a huge amount of documentation online and has been online for some time in connection with that. But how are we going to address that? Because that question mark is still sitting out there now about the failure of the contractor. And the Minister, who came back in response to the committee report, highlighted the fact that he felt even that report didn't really reflect in full the contribution of the contractor's non-performance, contract management and financial management described in independent evidence. So why are we being so precious about this? If there's an issue here, if there's evidence pointing to non-performance by the contractor, which has contributed to charges on the public purse, if there's been applications for funding which have not been, shall we say, done in the correct way, all that should be brought out and highlighted.
I think I would respond to, so we absolutely recognise that the work of the contractor is of course part of the story of where we are today, set out very clearly in the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee's report. As we touched on already, about how we arrived at the judgment as to where our work was best focused in building on the work of the Rural Economy Committee, recognising that there are many differing views about the circumstances that we are in today. But if I may perhaps just repeat the point that Anthony makes about public sector contracts do fail. So the Ferguson shipbuilding circumstances aren't the first. So, but where the contract is properly used, it provides insulation to the public body to end the contract should they so wish. And I think these are the unique circumstances of this contract, is that the transfer of risk under the typical shipbuilding contract that would normally rest with the contractor wasn't properly applied. And therefore, the risk came back to the public sector body. And usually, where in such circumstances, they would typically rest with the shipbuilder. And those are the points that, amongst others, that we sought to reference. I think in terms of the work of the contractor, Mr Beattie, I'm sure, and I think as we make the recommendation, is that will be subject to further consideration. And again, apologies for repeating myself, but I think we do recognise that is part of the story, and particularly reference the judgment arrived by the turnaround director and the extent of operational challenges, failures in the shipyards once they were subject to review.
I mean, we've talked a lot about the contract, and we can argue about different aspects of that, but contracts are really only there when things go wrong, so that there is something to refer to. Here we have a situation where, again, referring to the committee report, the allegations are that the company did not act in the proper way in order to receive the correct payments. Now, that to me is as I say, contracts are there when things go wrong, but generally speaking, you don't expect things to go wrong. Generally speaking, delivery is made in goodwill and all the rest of it, and parties work together. This has not taken place. So, there's a lot of questions around this, and these questions are going to get bigger and bigger. I would ask if you're going to carry out an investigation to ensure that the contractors' apparent failures are highlighted, or that they may be explainable. I don't know. But at the moment, this is where the big questions are.
In terms of the number of points, for me trying to address all of those, we'd agree that the contracts are there to be enforced, for good times and for bad, and provides both the provider and the purchaser with safeguards. Clearly, in the circumstances of the application of the traditional shipbuilding contract, the industry standards are not what, as we've mentioned already, we would expect to see in a public sector context. But nonetheless, those are the industry standards. But the absence of the 100% builders refund guarantee meant that the risk grew for the public sector body. And when circumstances went awry, as they did here, is that then risk and additional payments flew to the Scottish public sector. Jill might want to come in again. I think talk about the payment schedule and the fact that that wasn't aligned with the quality of the work, and that's clearly a significant part of the story. And as we've mentioned and set out in the report, that CMAL have already responded to that part of the recommendation, that is much more closely connected in future matters. Lastly, before bringing Jill in, of course we will reflect on what further work we can undertake to add further to the circumstances. We won't arrive at that judgment today, Mr Beattie. I think we will reflect as to any further evidence sessions, and particularly the recommendation that we finalise the report on for CMAL and the other public bodies to undertake a full review, lessons learned of the events that took place.
My simple question to yourself is, all that money that was paid in, where did it go? What was it spent on? Because it wasn't in the yard when it was nationalised. Simple question.
So there's a combination of things. Jill again, I might want to cover both of these points and some of the detail of it. When we arrive at the £240 million and the analysis of that, Jill can set out, we include both the amounts paid to the contractor and also the loans that the Scottish Government provided to it, some of which that it was able to recover through the administration process and the valuation of the assets that were on the yard at the time of nationalisation. But clearly, you know, the scale of money that was invested didn't bear any resemblance to what was initially anticipated that would be delivered for such a size of public sector investment. Jill, are you able to cover both those points?
Yes. Your first point, Mr Beattie, on contractor failure, I just want to make clear that we were very limited in what we could say about Ferguson Marine because it was a private sector organisation. So although we did speak to them and reviewed a lot of documentation, we could not report any issues that we found with its spending, with its decision making, etc. What we could do was report what CMAL was reporting to Transport Scotland and to the programme steering group, and I think we have said that in several places, that it started highlighting that there was issues with FMAIL's performance as early as December 2015, so only 2 months after the contract was awarded. We were not able to say ourselves whether or not we found those, one, because Ferguson Marine no longer exists, so we couldn't go in and see for ourselves, but as I said, we didn't have that remit to make those judgments about a private sector organisation. I think, though, we made the point very clearly that CMAL was consistently reporting issues with the contractor, but I also think it's very clear that FMAIL completely disagrees and it has a different point of view, and it firmly believes that CMAL was responsible for the delays to the project. In terms of the out-of-sequence working that you mentioned, we have mentioned that in the report. FMAIL itself admitted in evidence to the REC committee that it did engage in out-of-sequence working just to try and keep the project moving, and that was due to delays with CMAL approving the designs. We have spoken to independent shipbuilders who said that out-of-sequence working isn't necessarily an issue, and it can take place, to keep the project moving and to make for more efficient working. But CMAL reported that FMAIL's approach in out-of-sequence working was an issue and caused problems with the project. In relation to the £14.55 million that you mentioned and the invoices that were submitted that were not related to the project, that specific point, so this was an agreement that ministers had made with FMAIL for CMAL to accelerate the £14.5 million. Before the CMAL board had made that decision, ministers had agreed with FMAIL that that would take place, and CMAL only agreed to it subject to very tight controls, which was FMAIL must submit all the invoices related to the project. CMAL would review them and make sure that all of the money that they were accelerating to FMAIL was being spent on the suppliers, equipment, etc. for the vessels. And our understanding is that there were some invoices that were submitted by FMAIL that were not directly linked, but CMAL refused those. So there was no public money spent on, well, none of that £14.55 million was given to FMAIL to spend on anything else. In relation to where the money went, that's a question that we asked several times. So CMAL paid £83.25 million out, but as we set out in Exhibit 6 of the report, there was a significant amount of work outstanding. I think typically, on a typical project with a 100% refund guarantee, that provides a significant financial incentive for the builder to build a quality product. Because that guarantee wasn't in place, that same level of incentive was not there. That therefore placed more importance on there being a very clear link between the payments that CMAL was making and the quality of the build. And as we say, that link wasn't there. So CMAL was legally required to make the payments, but because the milestones weren't clearly defined, I think that's what caused the issues. So the money was being paid out and the vessels weren't being constructed as we would have expected. The £45 million loan from the £45 million loans from the Scottish Government. The first loan, £15 million, which was made specifically for vessel progress, was drawn down very quickly by FML, £13 million within 2 months. And that was because it had substantial number of outstanding invoices. They had suppliers who were threatening to withhold equipment, materials, etc. They had subcontractors threatening to walk off site. So that money was very quickly drawn down and made very little difference to the project. The second loan, the £30 million loan, although PwC were providing the Scottish Government with reports on FML spending, they didn't go into the level of detail of where that money went. So we weren't able to trace exactly how that money was spent and what progress was made on the vessels. But we were told that suppliers were paid, the workforce was paid, and that enabled that kind of stopped any legal action against FML and allowed progress on the vessels to continue.
We're really running short of time. Yes, I think. Well, I think the point is, I think we've all got a lot of more questions, and that's one of the reasons why I think we've demonstrated that we really do need to have at least another session to look at this. I didn't, and I know there are members of the committee who wanted to come back in, myself included. I did mention at the start of the session that Rhoda Grant was joining us remotely, and so for the final couple of minutes we've got, I'm going to invite Rhoda to put any questions that she wants to put to the team who are here with us. Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener, and I appreciate that. But as others, I have a lot more questions, but I'll keep my questions quite short as to get some clarification. Listening to the session, it seems to me clear that there was communication that was documented between CMAL and Transport Scotland, but it was Transport Scotland that came back to CMAL with ministerial decisions. Is there any paperwork regarding Transport Scotland's discussions with ministers, how they put that to ministers and which ministers responded?
Maybe just ask Jill to talk through the chain of events again. Jill.
There was no documentation to explain any of the discussions, the assurances that Transport Scotland put in place, which they agreed with ministers, which allowed CMAL's board to agree to approve the contract. We did ask for all documentation related to the ministers' decisions, and we did not get any.
Okay, so there is nothing regarding ministerial decisions and how that was carried out documented. I also understand that that decision was taken within a day. Would that be normal? How would you normally expect a decision of that magnitude to be taken within government?
I'm not sure we would be able to give you a precise or reasonable comparator to this decision. Some decisions will be taken at pace, and some will be more considered depending, I'm sure, on the availability of ministerial diaries and so forth. I think the point that we look to set out very clearly in the report, though, is that where decisions of significance are taken and where the risks are coming back to the public sector, those ought to be documented for public records.
And at the level at which they are taken, at which level would you expect such a decision of this magnitude to be taken?
So it varies. Apologies, Ms. Grant. It varies. I guess what we look to set out at Exhibit 2 of the report is the range of accountabilities and responsibilities, and in the circumstances of the awarding of the ferries contract, that those rested with ministers. So yes, we would expect that to be documented. But I think the unusual circumstances here is that the contracting body, CMAL, identified additional risk outside of the standard terms and conditions of the contract, the builder's guarantee point that we've talked about already this morning. The fact that that context was applicable all pointed to the fact that it needed to be well documented as to the acceptance of those risks and how they would be managed.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. And we are literally out of time, and so I'm going to draw this session to a close and thank the Auditor General, Anthony Clark, Angela Canning and Jill Miller for joining us this morning, and extend an invitation to you to return at the earliest opportunity that we can make. But thank you for your evidence this morning. We've got a whole load more questions that we need to ask. We've got some consideration to give to what our next steps might be, but I do want to thank you for your openness and willingness to answer the questions we've put to you this morning. So with that, I'll move the committee into private session. Thank you.